Hello, and welcome back to the Patristica podcast. Today I'm joined by my usual co hosts, Marcus Vincent and Mark Bilby, but today we have a very special guest, Jason BeDuhn, who will introduce himself in just a moment. Before we kick off, just a couple of housekeeping things. As usual, down in the description are the patrons of Mark and I, as also my Twitter handle. So please go down and follow us there. At the end of every episode, we're going to ask more questions from viewers, and it'd be great to hear more engagement from you as we go forward. But today, we're going to be talking about the reconstruction of lost texts. How do we go about finding out what Marcion and his New Testament had in it, as we no longer have these texts in any manuscripts? And we are so lucky to be joined by Jason for that reason, who is an expert at reconstructing Marcionite texts. Jason, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and perhaps how you came to know Marcion?
Sure. Thank you, Jack. So I'm Jason BeDuhn. I'm a professor in Northern Arizona University in the Department of Comparative Cultural Studies. I'm a specialist in the historical comparative study of religions. And how I came to Marcion is a bit unusual, I think, because I concentrated previously in a later period of the development of the Christian tradition in with the sectarian group the Manichaeans, and how they developed a form of Christianity that was more acculturated to the Mesopotamian and Iranian world, and then spread across all of Eurasia quite rapidly and for a long time. So I was working mostly in third and later centuries. And so I've worked my way back in time to the work of Marcion and other earlier Christian developments that preceded the Manichaeans. One of the key aspects of the Manichaean engagement with other Christians was debate over scriptures and the interpretation of the Gospels and of Paul, particularly. And there was a lot of debate between Orthodox and Catholic leaders and Manichaeans over the authority of the scriptures and specifically on the redaction of the scriptures. The Manichaeans raised critical questions about how the Gospels were composed. They made a point of the fact that people later recalling stories and recalling teachings put the Gospels and other things together. And therefore, they were not an ironclad, reliable source for the actual teachings and life of Jesus. And so that was something then that pulled me back into those earlier debates and discussions, the attacks on Marcion, and then calling into question whether those attacks were informed or ill-informed, whether the people who wrote against Marcion and claimed to describe how Marcion prepared his text, whether they were even in a position to know what Marcion had done, because they were, a couple generations later and obviously had axes to grind. So that's how I got pulled back into the Marcion work and realized that there was a lot of problems with how the Marcion's New Testament had been reconstructed in the past. And so I saw room for innovative work to try to do a better job.
That's fascinating because we gave um, our journeys to Marcion last week, and again, a completely different version account of how you got to Marcion than us three. And I think that's so indicative of where Marcionite scholarship is coming from at the moment. Is that because none of us were taught it in mainstream academic terms, or were aware of lots of literature on the subject. We've all seemed to have stumbled upon or happened upon Marcion rather than having thrust upon us, like, for example, maybe the Q document or other such sort of mainstream ideas. So
Mhm.
yeah, thank you so much. And also make sure you go and pick up a copy of Jason's book, The First New Testament, Martial and Scriptural Canon. It's fantastic, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Which leads us on to nicely, how do we go about reconstructing these texts? It's certainly a question that I asked when I first came to Marcionite study. Marcus introduced him to me as a figure, and immediately then, without any sort of further information, I just Googled him and said, well, hey, what's his text? Where can I read about him? And it became immediately apparent to me that this was an impossibility. And so I went back to Marcus and said, what do I do next? And he said, well, I'm currently in the business of reconstructing him, and here's some other reconstructions. At which point, then, you are, as a newcomer to Martial Arts Studies, overwhelmed by the differences in some of the reconstructions, both of his Evangelion and also of the apostolos, or the Pauline epistles, the Pauline corpus that he has. And so I guess one of the questions that both myself and many viewers will have is, how do you go about reconstructing these texts? Like, what's your first port of call when you say, I have nothing, but I want to completely bring it back to life? What was your first step, Jason, in that process, particularly with the Evangelion?
Well, with the Evangelion, then the question was first to identify all the possible sources and to reassess what earlier scholars had said about what might be reliable sources and what might not be reliable sources. And I found I came to different conclusions than a lot of my predecessors on that, and that there was actually a wider range of sources that could be used to reconstruct the Evangelion that had been neglected. And I'm thinking particularly about a text known as Pseudemephron A, um, and also actually an anti-Manichaean work, the Acts of Archelaus, which has a section in it which I had earlier, just as I was getting into Marcion, identified that the material that had been reused and repackaged for this anti-Manichaean tract had actually been originally an anti-Marcionite tract, and so it had been sort of incorporated as heresiologists often did, right? They often recycled and reused arguments against heresies, and that they kind of tended to lump together anyway. So once you identify all those sources, then you have to figure out how, from largely polemical, hostile sources, you can reliably get a text, and that involves being aware of their own methods, what the heresiologists or the polemicists themselves were doing and how they did it, and also how they would quote particular passages themselves in other contexts to make sure that their own text of the Gospel of Gospel of Luke, for example, was not coloring how they phrased or remembered a passage from the Marcionite Evangelion. So you have to do that critical comparison to make sure that what they're giving you in their response to the Marcionite Gospel is something that is an independent witness to that text and not to their own biblical text. And then, of course, the hugest challenge that we all face is that these different sources don't all agree, and how to explain the fact that they sometimes present quite different texts. And so it is a very methodical process. It is, from some number of perspectives, it can be a very tedious process. And it's one that I find my principle of approaching it is not to be too imaginative. I think imagination is a real danger for a historian, as strange as that might seem. Let the material tell you exactly what it wants to tell you, and stop there. And there were a lot of methodological errors in previous attempts to reconstruct Marcionite's gospel. The most oppressive one of which was the acceptance of the polemicist's view of Marcion, right? So before a decade ago, all the work on Marcion's gospel accepted as a premise that Marcion had edited his texts, edited texts that he received, and that he edited them in accordance with the beliefs he had. And so that then shaped Harnack and other figures in terms of how they read the evidence and what they imagined in the spaces between the evidence. And so that's what I've tried to resist in my work and my approach.
That's interesting. So, can you give us a concrete example of where you think one of the previous reconstructions were too imaginative, as you put it, in their text, where they went a bit astray with their own biases?
Well, the particular bias I just referred to was one in which Harnack would look at evidence and actually weigh the reliability of the evidence on the basis of the idea that, oh, that text could not possibly have been in Marcion's gospel because it's contrary to Marcion's teachings, right? So that kind of approach meant that he was actually evaluating sources on preconceived ideas of what Marcion could or could not have had in his gospel. And that was based on the assumption that first of all, the Marcion would edit texts, and that he would do so to force his ideas into the text, or to carefully remove things contrary to his ideas. But if you take the most conservative reconstruction of what the evidence gives us, there's a lot of things in very well attested material in the Marcionite Gospel that, if we compare it to what the polemicists tell us was Marcion's teachings, they clearly are not aligned. So my proposal is Marcion did what Christian interpreters have done for 2,000 years. They had texts and they read into them what they believed, and they weren't bothered by the fact that on the surface the wording might not have aligned exactly with their belief. That's not really a problem for interpreters. They're pretty able to read into a text what they want to see in it, and it wasn't necessary for Marcion to cut and paste to make it all work for him.
Could I ask a follow-up question? Jason, I wonder what metaphors or analogies you might use for the reconstructive task. So I have a friend who mentioned the idea of, an ancient vase that was shattered into 1,000 pieces, and reconstructing Marcion's gospel is like putting the vase back together again, or an old mosaic or an old painting or something. What kinds of metaphors do you feel like might, obviously they're all limited, but what do you feel like the reconstructive task was like for you?
I'm going to reveal just how unimaginative I am. Because I work a lot with actual manuscripts, right? Damaged, fragmentary manuscripts. So my metaphor is a very close one. I treat these sources like Tertullian or Epiphanius. I treat them like fragmentary manuscripts. And exactly where they start to quote, that's where our fragment begins. There might be lacunae in it. There might be gaps in the text where they kind of skip in their quoting and things like that. So it's very much like manuscript work for me when I work with these sources.
And in our recent work on a Greek critical edition corresponding to your English presentation, you had a preference specifically for Epiphanius because he's attesting to a Greek text. Even though he's a couple centuries later than Tertullian, you find him by and large, at least for establishing a Greek text, to be a more reliable or starting point for reconstruction. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement, not only because he's quoting in the language that Marcion's Evangelion originally was, but also because he very clearly communicates his methodology, which is that he sat down with a copy of the Marcionite Gospel and he copied out passages. And then later, we don't know how later, it could have been 20 years later, he sat down with his notes and responded. But the fact that he started with a very almost student-like copybook kind of approach, I'm going to copy out passages that I think, well, that turns on a light bulb for me. The Marcionite Gospel says this is nothing like Marcion's teaching, this is like our teaching. So that gives us his approach to copying texts verbatim, which we can't be sure Tertullian ever took that step, right? Tertullian might have been working more loosely or largely from memory or in other ways. And so I think that's very important to know, when we can know, which we often can't, how the polemicists themselves were dealing with the text. And he admits in his tract that he doesn't have the gospel in front of him anymore. He has his notes. And that's very helpful to know exactly what terms he was dealing with.
Interesting that to sort of be aware of how to weight different witnesses, that some may or may not be more trustworthy or have a historical accuracy compared to others. Marcus, how do you find this? Does this resonate with you as Marcus is currently reconstructing the Pauline epistles according to Marcion? Is this something that resonates with you? Do you have some of the same issues, the same problems in your work?
Yeah, of course. I mean, Jason and me have quite a number of parallels. I mean, I approached Marcion from retrospection, right? Coming from patristic material and working half of my life on medieval stuff. And exactly like Jason, working on manuscripts. So I've reconstructed all my life. I've done my PhD on the reconstruction of Asterius's fragments. And So reconstruction is my life's business somehow. And I would agree also with Jason, the biggest problem for historians are always the historians. It's less the material. It's our preconceived ideas. That's why I've written this book on retrospection, just to make sure we become aware of our glasses and of our preconceptions. So because we are, I mean, like Heisenberg, I mean, we are the importers of the unsharpness of the material. It's not the material most of the time. And second, I think for me, and that's why I've also written this book on retrospection, it is first, even before I approach my material, and maybe that I would stress a bit even more than Jason has done, even before I approach manuscripts or fragments or whatever it is a question of methodology. Because whatever you see in front of you, I have to see it through my glasses, right? So if I see you now, if you were the fragments, I'm lost, yeah? So I need my glasses to see the fragments. But then I see the fragments as I see them through my glasses. And if I'm not aware that I'm carrying those glasses, I'm seeing whatever I think I see, but I do not see. And that's the first thing. So methodology comes before the material. And I give you one example on Marcion. Since Irenaeus' time, at the latest, until today, and there are a few exceptions, very few, we've all thought that Marcion was cutting down a larger, older text. And hence, already through this kind of a methodological assumption, you exclude a variety of potential witnesses. And I think this is, for example, one step Matthias Klinghardt has taken more seriously, because when you invert the assumption, which is before you see any material, it is a methodological question. So if you invert the assumption and you say, oh, maybe that is an apologetic or a heresiological point that Irenaeus has made and everybody has taken on board, almost everybody. If that's a potential misleading assumption, and the other assumption might have a chance to be true, which means that it is the canonical text which has reworked an existing text, then suddenly the canonical text becomes the first and probably the most reliable witness. Just as in Irenaeus' version, let's take Tertullian's commentary on Marcion's New Testament, is the oldest existing commentary that we have. It's the only one and the earliest one that we have. And it's amazing to me that 98% of New Testament scholars do not even know, let alone read, our oldest commentary on their material. You can check the commentaries on the New Testament, Pauline letters, and on the Gospel of Luke, which are the closest text to Marcion's text. I promise you 80 to 90% of these texts do not even mention Tertullian. This is what I mean by methodology. So if you think and follow Irenaeus' suggestion, you do not need to look at Marcion's text because it's only an abbreviation, let alone the commentary that Tertullian writes on this subversive text. But if you invert the story and ask yourself, let's test the assumption that the canonical text is our first witness to the Marcionite text, then you have to read all canonical texts as potential witnesses to this text. And that also implies that all manuscripts that we have from the canonical texts are potential witnesses. And this is the assumption that Matthias Klinghardt has then pursued and has discovered that, for example, in a number of readings, particularly the Syrian texts, some Coptic texts, but also a lot of Latin texts. So the Western tradition, as it was called, against the sense, because there were more Oriental texts than there were Western texts, yeah, that a good number of the so-called special readings that Epiphanius or Tertullian or anybody else attests to be readings by Marcion can actually be found in the manuscripts. But not in the manuscripts of Marcion's text, but in the manuscripts of the canonical texts.
Mm-hmm.
And this, of course, doesn't make any sense if Irenaeus' version is correct. So you wouldn't need, and you wouldn't take into account those variations which you find in the manuscripts. And until this year, I mean, we have just an enormous volume that appeared last year, I think, on Luke's Gospel and the deviating manuscript readings. And this book makes a big case that none of these readings are Marcionite at all, because they are part of the canonical tradition and canonical manuscripts. So it's a question of methodology.
Mm.
That's the first thing. And once you have the methodology clear, you have to test yourself whether your methodology is appropriate. So you always have to test your methodology against a potential other approach. And whenever I think about it, I always think in two ways at least. So it's the potential that Irenaeus is correct, that Tertullian is correct, that the heresiologists are correct. And does it make sense when we compare then the material? Or is it easier? And here comes a methodological point, I think, which is also strengthened in Matthias, which I also like. This is the so-called Occam's razor, which is not by Occam, as we know, but it's called the Occam's razor, which means no historians can make truth statements. That's the first thing. Second statement is, if we have to weigh the evidences, any second layer explanation, which needs more invariables, is less convincing. That's Occam's razor. So if you can explain 1 + 1 is 2 without having a third hypothesis, it's easier than to explain 1 and 1 is 5, because I have to take away 3. So instead of having a second layer explanation, if you can explain the facts and the evidence that you see in one go, it is better than to play billiard and to have 3 goes to find the hole.
I like that analogy, and I largely agree with you. But the immediate follow-up to that is, and you already mentioned that so many New Testament scholars don't even mention Tertullian, because they have this view basically that the canon is finished and any text that's written after it, according to the traditional dating, is obsolete, right? They just forget about, there's a strict dividing line and then everything else is gone. But if it is that simple, and it is Occam's razor, then what is leading to this, or has led to this neglect of Marcion and Tertullian and other early Christian texts? Why is this happening? What's the underlying cause? Because my first assumption was that, okay, conservative Christianity, right? Most scholars in the field, going back in time, conservative Christians, doesn't suit the narrative. But even now, I've seen reluctance to engage, and even sometimes outright aggression and animosity towards our position from secular scholars who have personally no skin in the game in some sense. So why do you think this is playing out or not playing out, I should say, in among colleagues? I'm open to any suggestions from any of you here, because I think it's a serious question. Why are colleagues from our field not engaging with us properly, or why haven't they engaged with it in the past?
Well, it's intellectual inertia, and just to be very frank, very poor quality of graduate programs in this field across the world. It's just laziness. It's just let's do another of the same kind of work we've been doing. And behind it, I think, is a kind of terror, a kind of let's not open the door to reconsidering everything, right? They're afraid that the whole construct's going to come apart. I mean, even people who work on patristic material are terrified by confronting the fact, for example, that almost all our patristic manuscripts are medieval and later. They don't want to open that door to the fact that we actually don't have, datable, reliable sources of a lot of these materials, and we don't know what they look like before. Full well knowing, just from biblical studies, just from looking at biblical manuscripts, full well knowing that scribes were always altering text, always altering text. Every step of transmission is an alteration. So to open the door to all of that is just a terror, a night terror for them. And so they would rather hunker down in doing very, traditional kinds of things. And as you say, it's not premised on them having a religious commitment to it. It is premised on them being comfortable in a well-established field with well-engraved ruts in the road that they don't want to have to work to get out of. And it's frustrating to me. It's frustrating to me, the low level of scholarship out there, and the very repetitive and uninterestingly repetitive kinds of studies that are done, always, stacked premise upon premise upon premise, that all those previous premises are not examined, are not questioned, are not broken into and broken up. So yeah, that's my take on it.
I would echo that too, and just say that I think Marcus has made a great point, and a couple of his recent books that the divide between patristics and New Testament studies is entirely artificial. That is a product of graduate education programs and curriculum development, especially over the last 50 to 75 years. Prior to that, if you had asked Theodore Zahn whether New Testament and patristics could be divided, he would have laughed at you. And so that's the part that's part of all of this too, is just not studying, and it requires a depth and breadth that's difficult to master, and takes years and years and years of training and multiple languages and close reading practices and all this kind of stuff. So it's not simple to overcome it. But I also think there's a division between Hebrew Bible, where critical inquiry is more accepted, and radical source critical or redaction critical analyses, but the New Testament tends to be, I think there's more caution around that, perhaps because of faith-based concerns that you don't really want to. And then some of the debates are they've been going on for 100 years and they haven't really fundamentally changed. The Q versus Farr hypothesis, like how much longer are we going to continue to have the same debate over the same things? Like unless our goal is just to churn out more similar derivative books every year, like what's the point of that debate? And it almost feels like we just enjoy the debate. And like I get some of that too, as somebody who studied rabbinic literature and so on. Like there's an importance to the debate, in terms of thinking about all the issues and the nuances and all that. Debate dialectic is an important form of training, but just rehashing the same debates and not actually seeking after any kind of significant scientific progress in these things. So I think that's part of the issue too, is since Darwin, there's been a big backlash against, critical history of religions kinds of approaches, a lot of skepticism around those kinds of things. So if you even try to do any kind of like hard science work on these texts or make any kind of scientific truth claims, then that's seen as almost out of bounds, I think, in parts of the discourse.
Well, your point about debate, it is Noam Chomsky's point, that the debate is allowed within this range, right? And that's why I value Marcus's work so much, because he shatters the range, that allowed range of debate, and opens things up to real fundamental, radical reconsiderations.
And it's interesting, Mark, as well, that you brought up that distinction between Hebrew Bible and New Testament / patristic studies, because when I was at a conference, I presented a paper on the reception of Paul in the early church. And I was saying to them that what do you classify as a quotation or allusion or an echo? I mean, I'm not even sure what allusion and echoes really are, really. But, assuming that we agree on some form of definition of those things, where do we see Paul's reception in the early church fathers, for example? And I brought up that actually many of these quotations or allusions or echoes are extremely vague and not very well founded. And every New Testament scholar threw their arms up in their air and said, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about." And I had a Hebrew Bible man come up to me afterwards and said, "Joe, it's so funny because I always wondered that about New Testament colleagues of how they see so much parallels, have so many parallels where they want to." Because he said, if we did that, we'd be absolutely hung, drawn, and quartered. But you seem to get away with it. And there is that difference of mentality among New Testament versus Hebrew Bible people versus patristic people as well, I think.
But let me pick up this idea of mentality. I do think it is not just laziness. I can see a lot of laziness because it's also quite a tedious work we do. So it's not that exciting most of the time. Sometimes, yes. But I think it's also a question of intellectual discourse and debate, and probably even fashion of the day. Thinking about fashion, that dawned to me when I look at the development of fashion in the 19th century. So when we have moved away from Baroque clothes with all these colors and different forms and inventions and how men dressed probably more beautiful than women sometimes and whatever. But that's being reduced. I mean, and we could take music likewise, right? So we have Bach with his organ fantasies. And then towards the end of, or in the 18th century, that's been forbidden. Bach, when he was appointed to Leipzig, he was the first composer who was not appointed to the university composer position, because he was, as they said, too baroque, too inventive. Everything had to be rational. And then we get also in theology a kind of a rational approach also to philology, which leads us to enlightened philology. So we have the first time towards the end of the 18th century, people who look at these apologetic texts and distrust Irenaeus, Eichhorn, and others. And now we have a kind of rational approach to these texts for the first time. There is no way people just trust these texts. And so we come to Bauer and others, Hilgenfeld. But then we have a turn in the 1850s, where in clothing, you have what we call in Germany Biedermeier. So everyone dresses pretty much like us today. So men in black, women a bit more fancy, but restrained. And we have the most restrained fashion in the 19th century, the most boring appearances of people. and it leads to what we call a romantic period. And it is in this romantic approach that New Testament studies is being born. The first chair in 1870, the first split between patristics and New Testament studies. So New Testament studies, to me, it's like the Biedermeier of clothes. It's cutting down on life because it's more comfortable for having a debate between, let's say, this space than the potential world with 1,000 questions.
Yeah, if I can add to a little bit too, I think the artificial divide is also a very Protestant thing, to focus on the New Testament as the source and to really see the patristic writers as incidental, secondary, right? It just shows I think kind of more of a radical Protestant mentality, and maybe some of the bringing back together patristics and New Testament in our day is because of the acceptance of critical methodologies in Catholic circles. So we have sort of a rapprochement between Catholics and Protestants, where Protestants are starting to look at the Church Fathers again, and Catholics are starting to look more critically at the New Testament, and then bringing those things together. Reception history has become very fashionable in the last 10 to 20 years, but even that often tends to presume a sort of a static original text that is just interpreted in all kinds of creative ways later, rather than seeing evolution as the norm across all of these texts. So this part of the reason I come at these texts in this way is because I was reading people like Michael Fishbane and James Kugel on traditions of the Bible, and just seeing that Hebrew Bible is being retold all the time in all kinds of different ways. It's constantly changing and morphing, and Scripture is always reinterpreting other Scripture. It's a constant evolutionary process and multi-layer process. So the more you start taking those categories, the more the artificial divisions between New Testament patristics just fall apart, because the manuscripts are constantly changing, they're evolving. What we take as the Byzantine text type, that's not 2nd century or 1st century development. Those are 4th century artificially imposed readings that we just take as, oh yeah, of course those might have been 2nd century. But no, that's a whole theological program that was put on these texts, and the efforts at conformity. And I think that's where Jason's work on Manichaeism, it's opened you up to these, that the established narrative is not necessarily, does not get you to ground truth about what was going on in these time periods.
Yeah, that's right.
Mark, if I might just return us back to the main subject of today with the methodology, you spent a lot of time with making best friends with people like BeDuhn, Vincent, Van Manen, Schmidt, Harnack, a million other figures, Klinghardt, both in editing translations of the Pauline epistles versus canonical, Marcion versus Paul, and the Evangelion and Luke. What are some of the things that you've noticed in the methodologies of the people you've been editing? Because you are in a prime position, arguably more than maybe anybody else, to speak about this, considering you spent so much time doing it. I was very blessed to edit the Apostos translation with you, and I only saw just a small portion of this reconstruction work that Marcus did as it was translated, and I noticed a million things. But particularly among sort of the scholars, what are some of the big differences you noticed, say, between Vincent or Van Harnack or someone like that nature?
Yeah, the methodology differs from person to person. If you start with Hahn, he takes canonical Luke as a base text and then mostly just reads Epiphanius to omit certain passages, and that's it. It's a very minimally adjusted or refined text. And then Zahn starts to cut it down quite a bit more, using the same presuppositions, but relying more on the positive attestations of Tertullian and so on. So each editor kind of did his own thing. There wasn't really a consistent methodology. The points of consistency that I see is between somebody like Harnack and Roth, for instance, and that comes out quantitatively that both of their editions have about 4,300 words. And if you look at microscopically, Roth often makes similar word choices, or just assumes Harnack's text as a base text of a reconstruction that he will challenge at some points, but often defer to. And that, to me, that comes across even in some word choices. Like I think in the Sermon on the Mount, there's the verb oikterein, which doesn't occur in the New Testament. It doesn't occur in the source lingua graeca in the 1st or 2nd or 3rd century. So that's not a form that's reasonable. But Harnack had that particular verbal form. Roth follows it. So they're just places where there's influence among different scholars, and that in some ways that makes sense, because Harnack was the standard version of the Evangelion and the Apostolos for the better part of a century, and people just deferred to it, that it was so incredibly complex that we just kind of had to go with what Harnack said. So Tyson or Knox, when they're doing their statistical work, they're mainly just relying on what Harnack had done, and they're not really going back through all the primary source evidence. And that's where Jason really kicked off this new trend in the last 10 years of we just need to go back to the primary sources as an ad fontes moment in scholarship, particularly with the Marcionite texts. And each editor really has, you can start to see this when you start to compare them quantitatively. But it also, if you're doing the reconstruction, I would actually encourage people, if you want to, give it a try yourself, like reconstruct one passage on your own. Look at what Tertullian says, read that carefully, if you can read the Latin, great. Especially if it's something that's in Epiphanius and Adamantius dialogue and Greek and Latin. There might be other ones too that you might look at, but just get into the nitty gritty on one or two verses, just as like a test case to feel out the methodological challenges involved. Because as has already been brought up, you have conflicting witnesses, you have conflicting testimony. Tertullian might indicate a different text than Epiphanius. Epiphanius can contradict himself. Adamantius dialogue, the evidence can differ from one book to the other depending on who the interlocutor is, who the Marcionite representative is, or what stage of composition this was in the Adamantius dialogue. So everything really proceeds from just doing close reading, and I really think it's becoming more and more a process of fine tuning. And I'll almost think like you use the word weighting of it. I think that's helpful too, but we can also think about it as sort of tuning dials now. So how much do we turn up Tertullian or turn him down in a given passage or overall, because he gives us more attestations than anybody? How much do we turn up or down Epiphanius because he's our primary Greek witness? How much do we turn up or down Adamantius dialogue? But also things like, how do we turn up or down Codex Bezae? So if you read Klinghart's edition, in my view, he's got Bezae turned way up. The Bezae dial is very, very, very high in Klinghart's edition, so that even if he has no attestation in Epiphanius or Tertullian or Adamantius dialogue, if Bezae has the text, which it does for almost everything, because it's based on the canonical form of the text, but if it varies, if it has any notable variant on in a given passage or what have you, then he takes that as pre-canonical. So that is a pretty big assumption, and that leads him to have this far more extensive version that's almost 13,000 words when you add up all the words, compared to Roth at 4,000 words. So Bezae fills in a lot of those gaps for Klinghart. And that's where I think the methodology has started to change. Once I started going through this, I've been working on Luke for a while, but when I started looking at especially Epiphanius and his positive attestations, but also his negative attestations, and this is where I think there's a methodological shift in thinking scientifically about this. So, for Harnack and for Roth, it's okay to just say something is unattested, and that's it, and just kind of leave it vague and nebulous. You don't have to make a final commitment. Was this in it or was it not? You don't have to make a present or not present determination. And that was still a little bit evident in Jason's reading and his presentation with the ellipses and so on. But Jason went much farther than Harnack in actually trying to restore positive content, and then not really trying to justify or explain stuff that was not there, and not going into great detail about this was omitted or not, or the reasons behind it. So I think Jason put us on this more positivist track, and just let's try to restore what we can in this more binary way. But I think now we're at this point where we can really shift in our methodology and establish quantitative patterns. So in all the stuff that Epiphanius omits, right, that are in passages, why does the word people, laos in Greek, or the word polis, city, why does that keep occurring again and again and again and again and again in those passages? But the passages that everybody attests to, those words don't occur ever, or occur one time. So when you start to take this binary approach where we have attestation for stuff that's not in Marcion's gospel, and we can interrogate that for patterns, and then we have stuff that's attested for Marcion's gospel, we can interrogate that for patterns, then it becomes just a matter of, to me, data pattern recognition and then extrapolating. And I would agree with Jason in saying we don't want to get imaginative in that we're not doing our own artwork. I tend to think of this as like art restoration, but it's sort of in the mode of George Seurat. We are just going point by point, dot by dot, trying to restore a painting, but it's not our painting we're trying to restore. It's a real painting from almost 1900 years ago, but we have to almost go point by point through it. But to me, the omissions are just as important as the things we put in. If we say to me, like Klinghart's a painting, but instead of the Mona Lisa, it's a giant, it's a giant painting. But I think we're dealing more with a Mona Lisa. It's probably around 8,000 words, not something that takes up the whole wall of the gallery.
But I think when you're talking about a painting, I think that was really the leap, Jason, you prepared in the whole process of the Reconstruction history. That was your leap to move away from these, what I always call the Swiss cheese approach, where we are not giving more than the deviations, and the rest are just wholes, which gives no idea of a painting, which only gives fragments. And I think when you produced your first New Testament book, you, for the first time in the history of the reconstruction of Marcion's texts, produced a text on the assumption that Marcion didn't produce cheesecakes, or cheese holes, but had a gospel and produced letters. And of course, even your text has holes, but it is a text. And it was the approach to understand and hence question yourself what might have been in there. And you put that in brackets, which I think is fair. It's like you restore, as an archaeologist, a building, but you know it is a building and it was not a heap of rubble. Yeah. And that was the leap. 2 years later, Matthias Klinghardt does it in a different way, but also from the same approach. And I think that has changed Marcionite scholarship. And even if Roth doesn't do it, even from Roth's book, you don't get an idea whatsoever the text could have been.
Mm-hmm.
And from Schmidt, you don't get an idea of what Paul's letters were. I mean, you have only lines of attestations with some judgment with it.
Right.
But these are not letters. So the only gospel text we have is Jason's and Matthias's. We can disagree about the proportion and are the holes big enough or small enough or whatever. Yeah, but these are texts where we can get a sense of content and of language and so forth. And I think what you have just mentioned, Mark, I'd be interested, Jason, how you came to the idea that it's a painting and you did it the way you did it, because that was a major breakthrough. Let me just talk about what you've just said, Mark, about this dot by dot. When I started doing the reconstruction of Paul, I followed Jason's and to some extent also Matthias's approach, weighing the witnesses and so forth, right? I'm pretty much on the same track. I mean, whether we weigh it a bit higher or lower, codex Bezae is a question. Okay. And there one might agree or disagree in aspects. But what I discovered, without having dealt with your work, Mark, before, unfortunately, it would have saved me so much time. But what I discovered when I was in the middle of 1 Corinthians, where I'm stuck now again by the revision, it occurred to me that every so often, when I was looking and asked myself the question you just raised, is this verse present or not present? Because it's unattested. I discovered that in those verses, which were most of the time unattested, I found wordings, so a kind of lexic, words and combination of words, which reappeared in other verses which were unattested. And likewise, I discovered that there is a certain language which are present in the texts which are attested. And this kind of a special language was not due to the witnesses, because we found and find the same language, whether it's given by Epiphanius, or whether it's given by Tertullian in Latin, or whether it's given by somebody else of our witnesses. And this breaks down into the smallest details. And I've discovered most of the time it is more in the details than in the major words. So it is, I'll give you one example. I always have started checking the openings of the verses. Ean me kai un, tu estin, tuto estin, whatever it is. And I can give you, in the meantime, a list how canonical verses start. And they start 30 times, 70 times, 20 times. They're always canonical. They're never attested for the pre-canonical text. The pre-canonical text has also a range of about 20 starts of a verse. They never appear in the canonical text, except for the parallel verses. But they will never appear in verses which are unattested. So what I discovered is that we have two different forms of lexic. Some overlaps, no doubt, but we can clearly distinguish whether a text can be, must not be, but can be canonical. But I can clearly distinguish texts which are certainly not canonical, or certainly not Marcionite or pre-canonical.
Yeah.
And that's so interesting that, for example, I made the test case, and Mark knows it. I made the test case for the letter of Philemon. Now, the beauty with Philemon is all our witnesses who talk about the letter to Philemon is that this letter was present in the Marcionite collection. Now, all of our witnesses, none give us a single word. So if we now approach it from the previous Swiss cheese approach, Roth and Harnack and Zahn and all the rest, we have a hole, except for the title, Epistle to Philemon. If we look at Jason, I think it's still a big hole.
Yeah, it's a silhouette or a daguerreotype, right?
Because it's as people would say, it's guesswork. Yeah. Now I did the test on the lexic without looking into the text in the content itself. Sheer tedious work on lexic. So I excluded all the verses with canonical, can only and exclusively canonically attested lexic words. And I only retained those verses where not a single word was not pre-canonically or Marcionite attested. So simple, rational. And what comes out? A small, consistent letter to Philemon, which when I read the result, you can read it from verse 1 to the rest of the words, is a consistently coherent letter. A small letter, which actually fits so well the letter genre that we know of a few lines, where somebody writes to somebody about a particular case, and that's it. That was the result.
You mean
What
letters of introduction weren't huge and verbose in the ancient world?
Well, not always. I mean, pretty rare. Pretty rare. As Tertullian says, the introductions were always identical and not elaborate. Yeah.
I'd like to bring the conversation back to Jason's work, because I think part of what Jason did in 2013 was not only move us forward in this positive direction, but also emphasize humility, intellectual humility, as well as content over precise wording, which led to your choice in English to do a presentation in English. Could you share with us about methodological humility in this? Because I could see one of the responses to all of this being that we're grossly overconfident in all of this quantitative analysis that we're doing and positing a Greek text. So how have you wrestled with the importance of humility, of making positive claims when the evidence is often, complicated and murky?
Yeah, well, Yeah, to build on Marcus's point, I was myself curious what the content of the texts were. And so the content level was what drew me in, because I had come to it from Manichaean studies, where I had this anti-Manichaean text that I could show the antithesis structure was one that entirely depended on New Testament passages from the Gospel of Luke. And since Marcionites were not confined to that, I thought that was a very curious anomaly. And so from there, I went back into, the likelihood that this then was an anti-Marcionite passage, and that it was actually quoting from Marcion's Gospel rather than the Gospel of Luke. So the content, what actually was in there, was the level of my interest. And so the fact that I'm dealing with sources that are in Syriac and Coptic and Armenian, the other languages, Mark, from personal experience how you had to drag me kicking and screaming into doing a Greek text, right? because I really am nervous about the assumptions of translating back into a Greek from what I know is the freedom of translators and how they render things. So that was the level I stuck at, and I really appreciate, Marcus, your kind words about how that then gave us a text to look at. So what impresses me, and has been impressing me in the last couple of years then, is how Mark and Marcus and others are progressing to this linguistic level of analysis. And the whole new level of discoveries that are possible through this kind of analysis, through these lexical patterns. And this is something that is nothing that I've ever, tried to undertake in my own work. And so I'm very happy that the step I took has sort of set the stage for then this next level, where I'm anticipating all kinds of new insights and discoveries into how, closer and closer readings of what the Marcionites had and worked with. So that is, to me, a very happy reward of my work, is to see where others are taking it now at a level that I never anticipated doing.
And some of it is in the text themselves and in the witnesses themselves. But what I'm finding too is sometimes there are these broader linguistic patterns or diachronic language patterns that are evident. So searching the TLG, for instance, like the opening of Marcion's Gospel, Adamantius dialogue attests epichronois, right? At the times of Tiberius or Pontius Pilate.
Mm-hmm.
But other witnesses have, and Tertullian uses a dative, but it's enchronois, I think, in Epiphanius and other witnesses. But if you do a TLG search, you find that enchronois is much more common in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries, but epichronois becomes much more common in the 4th century and subsequent. So in that case, Adamantius dialogue reflects probably 4th century diachronic linguistic developments, and we should not impose that formula when there is a much more common formula, which we have attested and so on. So the more you look at the dative is the same thing. So dative, speech introductions were very common in the 1st century, and then they became less fashionable, like Marcus was saying with German clothing. We need to start looking at the fashion of decades and the fashion of centuries, and then start sifting our evidence and really like decontaminating. I think that's a big part of the process, is how do we try to get back as close as we will never be 100% sure, but how do we interrogate and scrutinize all of the data and look at it from every angle possible to try to decontaminate it as much as possible?
I think that's very valid, and I think it's wonderful that we have the technology and the data sets now that this kind of work can actually be done, and people willing to do it, which
And
is
just
fun as well.
And just to speak into that as well, I mean, I've noticed that when I'm looking at the Ignatian epistles, which is my area, that the 7 letters in the Middle Recension that are so widely accepted share loads of canonical themes, thoughts, lexicon, everything. But as soon as you look at the Short Recension, that all disappears. It
Mhm.
evaporates into thin air.
Mhm.
And you think, well, hold on now. Which direction is this moving in? Why are these texts seem to be coalescing around a certain style, certain thought patterns, certain grammatical constructions even? It's not even the case that it's just big theology. It's just the way we speak.
Mhm.
And they seem to coalesce around the canonical version in the Middle Recension versus the Short. just noting that it's coming up to an hour, I think it'd be apt now to move just to our final section to the day, which would be questions. Again, as I mentioned at the start, please do follow myself and Mark on Patreon, and myself on Twitter. It's a great place where you can engage with us and ask questions. And today we have 3 wonderful questions from our followers. And the first comes from Kathy, who is on Mark's Patreon, and she asks, how does the timeline of the gospel revisions outline in your this is you, Mark, in your The Gospel of the Poor? Does it agree or disagree with what I believe Dr. Vincent said regarding Marcion's gospel preceding Mark? Can you make heads or tail of that?
Yeah, I think so. But the timeline I gave for how I date these various strata and having multiple strata of gospel composition, I'm still inclined to go in that direction. Partly, I think that this might be a place where Jason and I align a little bit against Marcus's views, but I'd love for Marcus to clarify. But I tend to see with Jason an early form of Mark's gospel and something like a Q gospel that were sources in Marcion's gospel. And so but then I also see Mark being redacted later. So there are many passages in Marcion's gospel and specific wording where Marcion's gospel is much closer to Mark than canonical Luke or to Matthew. And it happens again and again and again. And then you also see these sequences where they align. So I'm trying to think like a DNA person, a biologist almost, and where do we find sequential parallels in passage after passage or wording after wording? So the combination of those things leads me to see a Markan source behind this. But I would align with Marcus in saying that what we know as canonical Mark was produced a substantive portion of it, and it was heavily redacted after Marcion's gospel was produced, and likely in response to Marcion's gospel. So I see multi-stage productions happening in these. But Marcus, is your view that Mark's gospel was produced in one go around the mid-2nd century, or do you see it as possibly a multi-stage production?
Actually, I've never looked into the pre-gospel stratifications. So that's a question which I would need to think about myself. But what I've done, of course, is from the experience with Paul and the Reconstruction, it appears to me, and maybe that's a parallel to the gospel development as well, right? What as an innocent person, I thought, before I did the Paul construction, I thought Marcion had written and composed the gospel from mostly oral traditions. These oral traditions could be, let's say, pre-Mark stages, could be. I've no problem with that. I wouldn't have a problem with that. And then I thought Marcion had picked up some kinds of a collection of Paul's letters, because that's why he gives the letters the name of Paul and gives no name, we come to that, to the gospel, at least no author. So I thought here he must have had some written material which already were given an author's name, and that's what he worked with. Now, having almost finished the reconstruction of Paul, I've come to a slightly different view. First of all, what struck me, and still, which is very difficult for me to explain, is that the lexic of the so-called Marcionite or pre-canonical, whichever way we want to call it, the lexic between the gospel and the Pauline letters are extremely close. And that's something which is so difficult to explain. I mean, if I have just functional words which appear 100 times in the canonical text and never appear in Paul, I can give you guarantee it will never appear in Marcion's gospel. And if function words are prominent in the gospel, they're also prominent in the Marcionite Paul. Now, how can that be? That's the question. So So it seems to me that the stagings or the development of the Pauline corpus is parallel to the development of the gospel corpus.
If I might interrupt you, Marcus, Einar actually has a question about this, and he asks explicitly, is
Yeah.
it possible that Marcion wrote the Pauline letters, and I assume he also includes maybe the Evangelion and that, or did he redact them? He asked that question just outright.
I think we probably have to move away from the idea of authorship and reductionism as being distinguishable. I mean, to what extent am I an author if I deeply revise material that I receive, be it in oral or in written form? What I discover from the lexical approach is that these two text sorts or text genres are expressed in pretty much the same language. That leaves us potentially with a deep reduction, or what others might call an author. I don't know. Second, I discovered that 3 of the 10 letters of Paul are of a different lexic. And it's precisely the 3 letters which scholars have always seen as non-Pauline, namely Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians. And whenever, like in the last days in chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians, whenever a verse is entirely from the canonical text, is entirely on the canonical side, is unattested and has canonical language, there is 1 or 2 words in there which are attested either in Colossians or in Ephesians, I mean in the Laodiceans, or in 2 Thessalonians as a pre-canonical attestation. So it's in Marcion's collection, but it shares the canonical lexic. And that tells me that Marcion seems to have had access to 7 letters to which he has a different source from the 3 letters, which interestingly come from a background which shares a canonical background, a canonical lexicography. If that were true, and you can make the counts yourself when I publish the text, it's just a matter of evidence. It's nothing made up. I mean, everybody can look at it and will not come to a different conclusion with regards numbers. So if that's the picture, then I have a first stage before the Marcionite collection. I have a stage with 7 letters with some kind of background and 3 letters from a different background.
Interesting.
Which tells me Marcion hasn't been a Shakespeare who has put together, or whoever was the one who put together the collection, but there were sources. And now the 7 letters seem to have some sort of coherent background in contrast to those 3.
Mm-hmm.
Is it Paul? Is it Marcion? I don't know. That's something we need to work and we need to see in the future. I don't know yet. But it's quite clear there are stages which are before that collection came together.
Interesting.
And we need to see whether that pins out in the gospel as well. And what are these potential sources? What is the sharing? Is that more with Mark? Is it more with Matthew? Is it more with whatever? I don't know.
Yeah. Great. And Jason, one for you. I think this is quite apt for you. This is from Louise. She asks, I'm under the impression that Marcion's Gospel, or Evangelion, is probably the first text which gets called that. Did Marcion create that term, Evangelion? Did he apply it first, or do you think it comes from somebody else? And did he create the genre even, perhaps?
I don't think he created the genre, insofar as there is a genre, which I'm not sure. But I think it's a difficult question. But I think Marcion is a transition figure, because there's a quote of Marcion in Tertullian, not from the Gospel, but from Marcion, another place where Marcion wrote or spoke, perhaps his prologue to his canon or his set of documents. And I know Marcus has read it differently than I read it, but I read it as Marcion still using the term Evangelion to refer to the teaching, as a generic term for the teaching of early Christianity. And so when he complains that he's encountered another gospel, it's not a text he's talking about. He's talking about teachings. He's actually using a Pauline phrase, right? Paul talks about missionaries coming and bringing a different gospel than what he teaches. So I think Marcion still uses that word for the teachings of the community. But I do think that he marked the transition to the textualization of Christianity, to it becoming a tradition built around texts. And that before him, texts had a relatively minor role in early Christianity. And because everyone who refers to Marcion's collection refers to this text under this term Evangelion, it's certainly possible that this was his coinage of I am now taking the teachings and sort of enthroning them in a certified text that will be reliable, that the community can refer to. If anyone teaches something in the community, if anyone has an innovation in the community, it can be checked against this charter document, this encapsulation of the teachings in the Evangelion. So I think he lived in a culture and in a time when the term is still a generic term for the teachings, but he is involved in connecting that term to a text. So that in the Gospel of Mark, when it says the beginning of the Evangelion, that author in the Gospel of Mark is still using the term in the generic, this is the story, this is the narrative, this is the teaching. But the Marcionite Gospel doesn't actually use the word in its text, but the fact that it universally is referred to that way suggests that Marcion was the one who decided that he's going to wed the term to a particular kind of text.
But interestingly, I wouldn't disagree.
Oh, good.
But I would take you a bit further.
Okay.
Because I think if you take yourself serious, which I do, that even when, and I believe that what you are saying is absolutely right, that Marcion understands that as his teaching or as teaching, I would not move too quickly to move that then to the application of a text, because by thinking of text, immediately we get the feeling that this becomes a canonical text. Mm-hmm. I think that he thought of his text as being teaching. So I would believe that he did not sit down to write a text, let alone a canonical text. Mm-hmm. I think what it is a series of teachings, and that's why we have these sort of pericopes, so stories, mm-hmm. which build mostly on words or on central tenets. So I do think you are right when he reads Evangelion in Paul, that is teaching. And I just had today in 1 Corinthians 14. Right in the beginning, in the first few verses, he makes a series of what is core, and he says it's psalming, so hymns singing, it's an apocalypse, and then he talks about didache, it is teaching. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to him, I think what he's doing and how he reads Paul is teaching. And that's why it's not yet, I mean, even if he does it in writing, it is a sort of writing which is meant to be teaching.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. It solidifies later. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think I once made the case, which is an hypothesis. So it's not evidence-based, but it's a hypothesis that he was only through the encounter with what he calls falsification of his text, That it was only these encounters with competing teachings in written form that he was forced to publish his text, which also then becomes the first published New Testament.
Mhm.
But I think that was not deliberate. It's like Tertullian produces the books against Marcion as his teaching,
Right.
has no intention to publish that, but gets it stolen. And because the stolen second edition is out there under his name, he then sits down and does a revision, which he publishes with a preface to distinguish what he has done from those rogue copies. And I think that's exactly the parallel. So that's the only evidence I have. But I think that's the parallel, how I see that Marcion was pushed from a purely teaching text, or
Mhm.
rather a teaching in writing, to a writing of teaching.
Hmm.
Fascinating.
Very.
Well, I think on that bombshell, this is a great place to call it a day for this podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, Jason. It's been a real
Yes.
pleasure, and also to Marcus and Mark. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I've been
Yeah.
utterly enthralled by it, and I hope our viewers are too. Again, just a reminder, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, do go and follow us on all our social medias, and buy Jason's book, The First New Testament. You will not be disappointed. It's a fascinating read, and one that I think about often as I move into other parts of research and trying to reconstruct this early Christian narrative that has dominated our field for so long. But
Just
again,
the word at the end before you stop the whole thing. If people are at the SBL in San Antonio, I'm not sure whether some of us are here, but I'll be there. So if people want to meet in person, please let me know.
there you go, an offer you can't refuse.
Yeah. I do.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.